that time we was moving bait and walking bait. We didn't know where that was going to take us 20, 30, 40 years later. So I've been doing this for a long time. And if you go back and look in, kind of in history, the guys that was fishing on, in Alaska, they're salmon fishermen and that kind of stuff, those guys was doing the same thing. They call it back bouncing. So a lot of the guys in this industry today think this is new, and it's not new by no means, no stretch of the imagination at all. Being as old as I am and being in this sport for as long as I've been able to see a lot of changes. So I was catfishing back when catfishing wasn't cool. Catfishing's cool now, but you don't have to go back very many years ago and it wasn't cool. You just didn't make a lot of publicity about it that's what you've done. I've been very fortunate over the years to do a lot of stuff. I've worked very closely with in-fishermen. I've done a lot of TV shows with them, a lot of print. I want to feel like that a lot of what I was doing 20 years ago has helped contribute to get this sport to where it is today. So it's been a long, long road to get to this point. And, back in the early 90s, I was a firm believer that we would get to this point someday, but it's taken a long time to get here. So I appreciate all the support for catfishing. And like Blaine was talking about earlier, I want to touch on that a little bit ago. We've got two camps. We got the guys that line, we got the rod reelers. A lot of them don't get along, but you know what? When I was a kid, what we caught, we ate. I'm a firm believer about catching fish and turning them loose, but I like to eat fish too. So this is a sport that is a renewable resource. So as long as we take care of it and we respect the fish and we're not game hogs and keep everything that we catch, this is something that can go on for years and years and years. And I don't want to get into the whole bass side of things, but they very rarely keep a fish to eat, if ever. I mean, we're lucky that the sport that we love and that the fish that we chase, it's a good fish, it's good nutrition, it's renewable, so we can rod and reel it, we can line it, we can do all that and still have a good population of fish. And we all camps need to try to come together. So, as I stated, I'm going to start off talking a little bit about bumping and walking baits. The other thing that I'll touch on a little bit, you don't have to go back very many years ago and you couldn't hardly buy a catfish rod. You could not hardly find any catfish specific pole anywhere. Very difficult. A guy by the name of Jim Morier was one of the first ones that actually had a line of rods specifically for catfishing. I come down here today, I don't know how many rods is out there today, but there's really the whole gamut, everything that you want. I mean, I feel proud too. I'm the original designer of all the Rip and Lips rod. I sold that company a few years ago, but that whole line of rods is rods that I developed and designed several years ago before we sold it. What I currently fish, I'm fishing all custom stuff. It's made by the Rod Shop in Kansas City. Actually, Tom's here. His whole family does these rods, and he's got a whole line of rods, from bumping rods, anchoring rods, and they do really everything. Bass, crappie, trout, on and on. Tom's been building rods for 58 years, so it's not new to him. That being said, I want to touch on something I have people ask me all the time. What's the best rod? What's the best reel? What's the best catfish boat? What's the best motor? The pat answer to that is the very best piece of equipment you can buy is the one that you can afford. You don't have to have the very best of everything. It's whatever you can afford. You can keep catfishing simple and catch a lot of fish. You can catch them off the bank with just an old wooden pole on the bank. You can spend $300 on a rod. You can have $600 tied up in one rod if you want to. So it's kind of all over the place. But again, in the end, it's whatever you can afford. That's the best piece of equipment for you. So to give you a little bit of background on this pole, this is a 7-foot, 10-inch bumping pole that I designed with Tom back in 2001 or 2002. So part of what I want to get across here today, if you guys watch the bass fishermen, if you're at home and you watch a bass guy on TV, when they pan across the front of his boat, he may have 15 or 20 different rods laying on the front of that boat. So if you really want to get really specific and really competitive in the catfish world, you've got to get really specific about your equipment. So we don't only have one bumping pole. You got a lot of these guys, they've got one rod with they're trying to make one rod fits all situations, and I get that. But if you really want to get down into specifics, this rod is designed for lighter weights. I fish a lot on the Missouri River, so we're fishing fast, swift current, but our depths on average is 25 to 35 foot, so we're not getting a lot of pull. You get on the lower Mississippi, say Memphis, you can fish 80, 90, 100 feet of water, 120 feet of water, and the current may not be as fast, but it's hot, but you get all this pull on your line. So you've got to have a stiffer rod. So we have developed a different, line rod specific for each condition that we're fishing for, if you will. So again, this rod's a 7'10" rod, and I'll go into what we kind of have on here. And if anybody has any questions as I'm going along, feel free to hold up your hand. I want to get everybody's, whatever they came here for today, I'll try my best to answer that question. So the line that I use 80-pound spider wire stealth, and that's a whole nother argument. There's a million different people. This is the best line, that's the best line. This happens to be the best line for me for what I do. I like it because it's really quiet in the guides. I don't like a line that's got, makes a lot of what we call line seeing in the water. So when you got a rough, coarser braid, it's going to make more noise in the water. I want something that's quieter and smoother that comes off the reel better. Coming off of that, the first thing that I have right here, this is called a McMahon snap. And we've been using these for a long time. We started using these because in the tournament world, if you're competitively fishing, you want to do things and make your life as simple as you can so you can change all your rigs as quickly as you can. This little snap, it's like a scissor snap. You just squeeze it, pop it open, and you can put a new rig on that fast. So before we get into the rest of this, some of my tackle bags, my rigging here, we keep everything pre-tied. So we got double hook rigs, we got single hook rigs, every conceivable rig that we can use on the water, it's all pre-tied while you're sitting at home. You're not trying to have to tie it when you're in the boat. And with these snaps, if you do get hung up and you break off, you can instantly change that. And especially if you're a guy that fishes a lot of nighttime tournaments or just fishing at night, it's hard to tie everything and have it all done. I would highly recommend investing in some sort of a tackle bag or something so you have it all pre-tied. It will make your life a lot easier. So coming off the braid, and this is I fish a 80-pound braid because we're fishing a lot of the big rivers. McMahon snap, 3-way swivel. Coming off of that 3-way swivel, depending on what we're fishing and what kind of current, or especially structure that we're fishing, we'll run anywhere from a 6-inch dropper to a 3-foot dropper. So if you're fishing structure that's got a lot of rock and stuff on it, we'll actually make this dropper longer. That way, as you're walking and you're moving that bait, you can walk that stuff. It keeps your hook out of that. And I've done this dropper a bunch of different ways. I like to just tie at the end of this. We just got a big loop, and I know this is hard for everybody to see in the back, but anybody that wants to see this after I'm done, just look me up and I'll show you what we got. But with this loop, you can take your sinker, you can change from a 4 ounce to 6 ounce to a 12 ounce, put a new one on. You can change and re-rig in a matter of seconds. So when you're in that tournament world, you want to make your life as easy as you can. And as far as that goes, even if you're not a tournament fisherman, if you're not a hardcore tournament fisherman, this kind of stuff just makes your life easier. So the older I get, the more I wanted to make it just easier on myself. Coming off of that, we've got about a 24-inch leader. My leader material that I use is, this is a 60-pound monofilament leader with a double hook rig. And you'll notice, for those of you that's close enough, in the middle of this rig, I've got a swivel tied right there. And sometimes we use a regular swivel, sometimes a chain swivel. But what we found, as you're fishing heavy current, that bait's going to want to turn and twist. You need another way in this line to allow that bait to move. If you don't, we get what's called line twist. You'll reel in and you just got this big wad on the end. So it's basically, everything is really pretty simple. And if anybody needs to get into knots and that kind of stuff, I can surely show somebody how to tie a knot. But the way, for those of you that are new to the game, because I have people ask me all the time, how do you learn how to bump? Anybody, every person in this room can learn how to bump or how to move bait or how to walk bait. But I suggest you start from an anchored position. It just makes it a lot easier. So go find whatever your structure is, whatever you're going to fish, anchor your boat so you're setting solid, and start from there. So the basic mechanics of this, we'll take this bait, the rod, once we're baited up, we'll drop straight to the bottom of the river. And you want to use a good high quality rod, whatever you're using, graphite or something that's very sensitive, because the whole thing about bumping or moving bait is feel. So you want to be able to feel this sinker hit the bottom of the river. So that is transmitted all the way up through this braid. That's another reason we use braid. You don't have that stretch, so it transmits that feel of that weight and everything back to your hand very easy. This rod, when we design these rods, it's called a blank through handle. So where this reel seat is, that rod is blank, is right there. So every time that sinker hits the bottom, I feel it in my hand right here. You've got to be in control of your bait at all times. So when this comes down and you're sitting there at an anchored position, the weight hits the bottom, you're sitting there with your rod up like this, and if you're fishing heavy current, this bait is up off the bottom like this. So you want to keep your hooks up out of that structure so it gives that fish an opportunity to find it. And then all it is after that is kind of a lift and fall technique. You want to lift that rod up, and when you feed it line, that bait just simply moves downriver. You lift it up again, you feed it line, and it simply moves downriver. So the easiest way to learn that technique, again, is from an anchored position. Once you get that mastered, then you can go with letting your boat slip. We call it slipping. And that's one of the things that we've struggled with over the years, and that's why it's so good having such a big audience here. It's just terminology in this sport, because you go back not very long ago, people didn't know what slipping was. They didn't know what bumping was. So part of what we have to overcome is just get that terminology down so people know what they're doing. So after you've learned how to walk bait from an anchored position, turn that boat loose, drop your trolling motor, start slipping down the river. So that boat's moving downriver, and it's your boat control at that time becomes critical. So you want to get the boat and you're moving that bait, everything in timing, okay? And there's a lot of different things you can do with that. I personally like to bump the lightest amount of weight that I can bump. So that way we can do what we call moving the bait. Because a lot of guys, if you watch them, they'll get out there 100 feet from the boat or 150 feet from the boat or whatever, and they're just keeping the bait moving along at the same speed as the boat. You can catch fish that way, and you can catch a lot of fish that way. But you will catch a lot more fish if you learn how to move your bait. And that is done by the current speed. As you're moving that bait, as that water's coming down that river, that the water speed is not just constant 2 mile an hour, if you will. The bottom of that river is doing this. So as you got that bait down there next to that bottom, sometimes you get a lot of pull where it's pulling hard. There's a lot of current there. And then the next place you hit is a real soft place. So what you want to do is you want to move that bait and work that bait down that river and make it look as natural as you can. Because what you're trying to imitate is a dead or dying bait fish that's just naturally drifting down that river. So when that bait, after it's died or it's injured, as it's drifting and rolling along the bottom, it's not moving at one constant speed. It speeds up when the current speeds up. It slows down when the current slows down. So that's part of the reason you use as light a weight as you can, because when you hit those soft, slower current eddies, you can move that bait. Because I'll tell you right now, a lot of times these fish, as we're moving that bait down that river system, they're in that area where that current goes really slack. So you've got that river bottom doing this. That fish, when you're moving that bait, and especially if you fish sand dunes, like on the Mississippi River or what we call sand dunes, when you get on an inside bend, that river does this. And I'm talking sometimes 20, 30 feet drops. And as you're walking that bait up that sand dune, if you will, when you start getting to the top of that, it pulls really hard because that current really picks up right there. But when it goes over the top of that and drops off, it just dies. So these fish, if they're inactive, they're laying in that trough. But if they're really active, they'll be setting right at the top of the sand dune or the top of the rock or whatever it is. So you need to really learn how to control the bait. And again, don't get me wrong, I see a lot of people just bumping down the river. They're out in the middle of the river and they're 100 feet from the boat. But when you get really good at what you're doing, you're moving that bait, you're working that bait, and you will catch more fish that way. To touch a little bit again on rod differences. Again, this lighter weight rod, I use it all the time on the Missouri River in some of the more shallow areas. This rod, we designed it specifically for the Mississippi River, and I know sitting out there in the audience you can't tell that there's that much difference between these rods, but this rod is a lot heavier in the butt section. It's something I don't want to be holding all day long if I'm walking 2, 3, 4 ounces of weight. But when we're on the Mississippi and we're bumping 10 ounces, 12 ounces, 18 ounces, you need a heavier pole. And part of the mechanics of bumping, I'll see people really moving their arm like this. When you have a rod and it's really light in the tip, every time you pull back to lift that bait up so you can walk it and move it, if you're using a heavy bait, the more that pole bends down like that, the more you have to pull back and lift that bait up to get it to move. So when you're fishing a heavy weight, you want a stiffer tip pole, so when you're moving that bait and you're pulling it back, you can move your arm this far to move the bait, versus if you have a limber tip pole, you got to pull that back another 2 feet to get that bait up off the bottom before you can move it. So I highly recommend, if you're going to get into it really heavily, is to match your equipment to what you're doing. Again, goes back to exactly what the bass guys are doing. He's got 20 rods laying up there on the deck of his boat because he's using each rod for a different scenario. No different in the catfish world. The other thing I'd like to touch on, I'm using, and there's a big debate on what's the best reel to use and all that. This happens to be a Shimano Dakota with a line counter. If you don't do anything else or glean anything else from this, get something with a line counter. When I learned this years and years ago, when we're out there, especially if we're in an anchored position and we're targeting a place, there may be a rock pile, a log or whatever, 100 feet, 200, 300 feet from the boat, we can take this. A lot of what we do too, let me back up a little bit. When we're out there and we're really trying to hone in on a fish, we're using our electronics. Electronics the last few years has came a long ways. You can find that big fish. You'll see this big arch. He may be behind a rock, a log or whatever. You can drive your boat up above that. We'll set a waypoint on that fish. We can go above that fish, lock the boat down, and with today's electronics, we can cursor back to that fish, and it will tell us he's 200 feet from the boat, he's 220 feet from the boat, he's 250 or whatever. So now that you know how far away from the boat he is, you have to have this line counter, okay? So you can sit there, drop that bait in, you can move that bait back down to that fish, and if he's sitting at 220, when I get down there about 215 or 218, I'm gonna set my rod in the rod holder, especially if it's a big fish. These little fish a lot of times will jump on that bait as it's going by. I'm a firm believer that some of these big fish, he doesn't commit immediately. He's gonna sit there and he's gonna look at that bait a little bit. So we'll set that rod in that rod holder right in front of that fish. And I've had that set there, sometimes it's almost immediate. He'll come in and load that pole and bury you right then. But a lot of times that pole will sit there about 10 minutes. And in about 10 minutes, that pole will start loading up. And I'm a firm believer on some of these reservoirs and rivers where we're getting a lot of boats out there. They're pre-fishing and you're catching fish and turning fish loose. They get line shy and they've been hooked, so they get a little wary. But the big fish, he's a little bit different animal. Set that rod down, give him time to eat it. The other reason we use these line counters when we're sitting there like that, even if we don't have a specific fish marked that we're fishing for, if you'll notice, and we noticed this a long time ago, as you're moving down the bait down the river, the first thing I do when I have a fish pick it up and bury the pole is I look down at my line counter. I want to know if I'm 200 feet from the boat, 300 feet from the boat, how far it was where I hooked that fish. Because I'll tell you right now, that fish normally is laying in that spot for a reason. Be it a log, a rock pile, he's laying there, that's his ambush point. And a lot of these fish that are 15, 20, 30 pound fish, they're usually not alone. There's another fish laying there. So the first thing I do when I get that bite, I look down, I know I'm at 200 feet. We'll walk back down there and I can't tell you how many times I've walked back down there and at 200 feet we catch another fish because they're laying in that specific spot because they're relating to some form of structure. So these line counters become very, very important. They'll help you in other ways too, just like when you're fighting the fish, as you're reeling it in, it counts backwards. You get to know, I'll tell my partner, he's 20 feet from the boat, get to net. He's 15 feet, he's 10 feet, get ready because I'm going to pull him up right now. So it will help you do that. And we've done a lot of TV shows. We know right when we're going to pull that fish up. That line counter will help you a lot of ways. If you guys are out there doing YouTube videos or just filming, you know right when you're going to pull that fish up with these line counters. It's a big advantage, it really is, no matter what kind you use. When we're talking about walking bait and moving bait, there's all kinds of different sizes of bait you can use. Are you going to fish a 2-pound skipjack? You're going to fish a 3-inch long shad or whatever it is. The biggest thing, especially when you're first learning how to walk bait or move bait, you want to bulk this bait up to where it'll catch that current, because you want that pull. That's what helps you move that bait away from the boat and down the river. So if you put just a shad on, no matter how long he is, if you lay that fish in the water, he doesn't pull hardly at all. That current just blows right by him. That doesn't allow you to have the pull that you need to move that bait away from the boat. So if you take that fish and you cut it up and you put a big ball of bait on here, guess what? You just added pull to that bait, okay? That helps you move that bait and get it away from the boat. Same thing, if we're fishing a whole skipjack on a double hook rig, we'll take that. We're a lot of times not just using just the bait. We may bulk that front hook up to add that pull. That gives us the pull that we need and the control to move that bait at the speed that we want to move it. Because as we're walking that bait, and you got that steady pull, but then your line kind of goes limp. You're in that little dead pocket. And again, that's where these fish lay a lot of times. We'll let that bait sit there as long as we can before we pull it up and move it. That allows that bigger fish time to come in and eat it. Any questions about bumping or moving bait? Yes, sir.
So you're slipping down the river in a high current situation like Northwest Iowa, Missouri River.
Yep.
You determine your speed moving down the river with your boat versus the current speed or versus land speed?
First thing I do, we've done this a long time, but if I really want to kind of get a feel for a new body of water, we'll turn the boat loose and just watch our GPS. You're going to find, like where you're fishing, a lot of times, depending on how high the river is, you're going to be in maybe a 3 mile an hour current. So your boat's moving, just drifting backwards at 3 miles an hour. So we figure out what that current speed is by our GPS on our electronics. Then we come back, we'll drop our trolling motor or whatever you're using to slow the boat down. We'll start off by slowing the boat down to half the current speed. So if it's 3 mile an hour current speed, we'll slow that boat down to about 1.5. That allows you to move and work that bait at the speed that fish can eat it. And I misspoke there a little bit. I do want to back up on that just a little bit. So the speed of the boat, we do try to keep it about half the current speed of the river. But I said that you need to slow that boat down so that fish can eat it. That fish is living in an environment, and I learned this a long time ago from a friend of mine, James Patterson, a guide on the Mississippi River at Memphis. He told me one day, because we was kind of getting into depth over walking bait and moving bait and doing all this other kind of stuff. He told me, he said, John, these fish make a living out there every day at full current speed. So as that bait's drifting down the river, that bait's just moving down the river. So when that bite is really hot, you don't have to slow the boat down. You can go wide open. I've seen a lot of boats just drifting. You see that all the time, that they're just drifting down the river at current speed. You can catch a lot of fish that way. But I personally believe these bigger fish, if you slow that boat down, you get your boat control where you need to, that's when you start catching your bigger fish. So, as we started refining our techniques, the biggest thing that we learned, once you learn how to move that bait, your next biggest thing is boat control. That's controlling that boat, that's slowing that boat down to the speed that you need to be at, and that's staying on. A lot of times where we're locating these fish is these blues, as I'm assuming most of you know, they love these ledges. So we'll find where the riverbank comes down, it'll come out a little bit and then it drops again. That ledge right there is a very key piece of structure. So I try to keep my bait right on that ledge as we're slipping. You'll just catch more and bigger fish that way. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Have you ever just have somebody drive the boat and use the motor instead of the trolling motor? Just kind of, in some places up here in Missouri where we fish, you're 7 mile an hour,
Yep.
It eats us
Okay, the question is, for those of you that can't hear it in the back, have I ever used a big motor or another way to slow the boat down besides the trolling motor? Because if you get in a situation where there's so much current, the trolling motor may not work or whatever. Again, going back to my friend James Patterson on Memphis, I talked to James, this is 25 years ago. We got to talking about slowing the boat speed down. You know what he told me? John, there's not always been trolling motors. So he was bumping and moving bait before there was a trolling motor even in existence. You know what he done? Log chain, dragging a log chain. And I've drug a lot of log chains down these rivers. I will caution you on the log chain. They will get hung up, and you could possibly get thrown out of the boat. One of the things we done to overcome that, I've seen a lot of guys take a log chain, tie it in the middle so you're kind of dragging two halves. If you just drag it on one end so it's just one long piece, that slows, that's better. But going back on boats, can you use the big motor? Absolutely. I run a little bit of different style boat than most of these guys do. I run a Lund big tiller boat. So I'm running a 200 horse tiller. I went with that boat specifically because what I like to do the most is bump bait and move bait. And if you get in a situation where you're in really heavy current, 2 or 3, 4 hours in, you could have no battery power left, and then you're done. So the boat that I fish with it's all power steering. So I have just a throttle on it. It says plus and minus. I can actually slow that big motor down. And so that prop is just slowing like this. I can fish any current speed for days and never run out. So you can definitely use your big motor to slow that boat down. And again, that's why I'm seeing more and more tillers come on scene. So a lot of guys, say you're using a ProCat 240, a lot of the guys, and you got that 225 or 250 Suzuki or whatever it is on there, you're going to start seeing more kicker motors. That kicker motor will do the same thing. I prefer the tiller because I've got more control of the boat to keep me on that, the break or the drop or the ledge or whatever I'm fishing. It's more, that goes back to boat control. But that's a very good question. That is one thing you can do is use the big motor to help slow that boat down. Yes, sir.
Again, in the high current situations, regarding keeping the bait on the bottom, line diameter seems to play a role.
Absolutely.
What's your advice on that?
So the question is line diameter when you're walking bait in a high current situation. That's part of the reason, going back to the line I fish, and it's a big controversy over what kind of braid to fish. This 80-pound spider wire stealth, if I'm remembering correctly, is the same diameter as 17-pound mono. So it's fairly, it's not very big around. So you want something that's not going to pull too heavy. Some of the braids that are on the market are really rough. So it's going to pull more. But that's kind of a double-edged sword. So when you're fishing a high current situation, I prefer a smaller, smoother braid because it's not going to pull as much. But if you get in a low current situation where you have very little current, that rough braid, it's actually going to help you because it's going to help pull that bait so you can move it.
As far as smoothness of the line is concerned, is there a gradient on the package that determines what the smoothness is?
Yeah, the question is, for those of you in the back, is there anything on the package that talks about the smoothness of the braid? As far as I know, there is not. That's something that we just pick up the package and we feel it with our hand. And again, that's why I'm a proponent of the smoother, slicker line than a really rough, coarse braid. Yes, sir, way back there in the back.
On bait, fresh or frozen, do you take it with you or do you catch it there?
Okay, question, frozen bait versus fresh bait, what's the deal? So that's a big topic and it depends on the time of year. I'll tell you that straight up. So in winter conditions, and I'll have some people argue this, but we actually put it on camera. So I have a lot of the big blue cat guys say you can only catch blue cats on fresh bait. Well, I'm going to sit here and tell you right now that is absolutely not true. So one of the baits that we use, it's specifically this time of year, and we filmed it, this show is still online on Lund Boats. You can go to lundboats.com and see the show. We use what we call a stink bucket, and it is exactly that. It's a stink bucket. We go out, we catch carp in the fall right before ice up. We'll fillet them. We got a bait refrigerator at home that we dedicate specifically to bait. So we put it in a gallon container or whatever. We cut it up however big we want it, put it in the refrigerator, and in about 45 days it does what we call make. So it's made, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a stink bucket. It's bad. But I'm going to circle back and hit your whole complete question. So reason we started doing this is this time of year when we get, and I know every part of the United States is a little bit different. So where I'm from, I live just south of Kansas City. So we fish a lot of years. We get lots of ice on the Missouri River. We had 2 or 3 weeks this year. It was just solid ice. So when we get all of our smaller tributaries freeze up and we get ice cover, we have a shad kill, a bait kill, or whatever. So all that smaller fish and stuff gets frozen in the ice. Then when we get breakup, that stuff starts falling and dropping out. Well, it sits there, it ferments, it starts stinking, it starts smelling. So all we're doing is matching what those fish are feeding on. So we do that basically like in January, actually a little bit later on. So usually February, March. When we filmed the TV show, we was getting ready for a Cabela's King Cat tournament. We won that tournament using stink bait. I had guys tell me, you didn't catch all them big blues on rotten bait. Well, I'm here to tell you that we did. So all we was doing was matching what those fish was feeding on in the river at that time, because they was feeding on fish that had died and was decomposing in the water. But back to your question, fresh versus frozen. So this time of year, if I'm going to Lake of the Ozarks or Truman Lake or some reservoir like that, I would prefer frozen shad. I had a young man stop me a while ago at Hillsdale Lake, which is pretty close to me. He said, you ought to see all the dead shad. They're all over the bank. They're everywhere. He said, I can pick them up by the bucketful. Well, all them channel cat and catfish that's in that system, that's what they're eating right now. So you want to fish what those fish are feeding on. So as the time of the year moves on, we get farther into spring, we're going to get away from the frozen bait. We're going to get away from the stink bucket. We're going to go to fresh shad. We're going to go to fresh skipjack. My personal belief is as you get farther into the year and that water is warmed up, you need to be fishing fresh bait. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, or kind of a big question. Yes? Oh, good. Any other questions about bait or moving bait or walking bait or anything like that? Okay. I want to kind of switch gears and go to 2 other topics. Actually, I could go on up here for a long time about the different things that we do. Last weekend, we fished Truman Lake, we fished Melbourne Lake, and I know a lot of you don't know where that's at. Truman Reservoir is right by Lake of the Ozarks, so it's central Missouri. Big system, big water, big body of water. I like going there early in the year, this time of year, because we catch a lot of fish. Last Saturday we caught somewhere around 70 blues. Sunday we didn't do as well, but we caught, in 2 days we caught about 100 fish. But that's what I want to explain to everybody here today. You don't have to own a boat to catch fish. You don't have to know how to walk bait to catch fish. You want to learn some of the ways where you can just go out and catch blues. So this time of year, after we get ice out, all that stuff falls and it's dying and decaying on the bottom of the lake or river or whatever it is, these fish, they can't regulate their body temperature, cold water fish. So what they're going to do is no different than what a human being or a dog or cat's going to do. They're going to go to the warmest part they can to warm up. They're going to seek that warmth. If you ever watch your dog or cat during the winter, when you have that sunshine coming through that window, that dog or cat's laying over there in the sunshine getting that warmth. These blue cat and channel cat do the same thing. So all these fish we caught last weekend, we caught in 2 to 3 feet of water. I have people tell me, it's February, you cannot catch fish in 2 or 3 feet of water. Well, I'm here to tell you, yes, you can. So these fish, they'll move out of the channel, out of that 20, 30, 40 feet or whatever your channel depth is, and they're going to start pushing toward the back of these coves on these big mud flats because it's going to warm up sooner. Okay, so actually last weekend, the difference of the temperature between the channel and that 2 feet of water was 10 degrees. It was 10 degrees warmer in 2 to 3 feet of water once we had sunshine. So what happens, the shad goes back there, the blues go back there, the channel cat goes back there, everything goes back there. So years ago, before I owned a boat, I just wanted to go fishing and catch something. So we learned how to go to the back end of these big reservoirs, be it Truman or Melbourne, and it can really be anywhere in the United States. It can be Tawakoni, it can be really all over. We'd go, and before we had a boat, we'd always go to the north side of the lake. The reason we went to the north side of the lake, where I'm from, we get prevailing south winds coming out of the south. And as that water warms up on the top, it's going to push that warm water to the north side of that lake. The next thing we always look for was a big point running straight south out into the lake. Well, a lot of people run and hide from the wind. We wanted to be in the windiest spot we could. Does 2 things. It pushes the shad to that side of the lake. It pushes the warm water to that side of the lake. So you want to be out there on the north side of a lake. If you've never been there before, go to the north side, find a big clay point or something sticking out. It's going to push the fish, the bait, the warm water, everything right to you. And you can catch. I've seen where we caught all them fish last weekend. This time of year, the bank fishermen are all over. So they're coming down there, they're catching the same amount of fish we are. They don't even own a boat. So you can keep this sport simple. You don't have to have a $500 rod and reel. You can go sit on the bank on a bucket and catch a lot of fish this time of year. So you got to kind of do what works for you in that situation. And again, that goes back to the rods. We've got different rods for every situation that we do. And again, you don't have to have all that. You can catch a lot of fish without getting that real specific. Any questions about shallow water fishing this time of year? Okay, I'm going to kind of move on to 2 other topics, getting into rods. As you notice, I bring a bunch of different rods up here. When we're anchor fishing, I prefer to use a different type of rod. This is a rod we designed just for anchor fishing. It's a softer tip, it's e-glass. Everything about this rod is smoother. These graphite poles are great as you're holding them in your hand, but the fish can feel you a lot better on that rod than they can on this rod. So if you're around a bunch of fish that's been stuck a lot of times with guys catching fish prior to tournament day, and you're going to anchor, lighten your rod up, use an e-glass rod, something that's lighter and smoother. Which brings me to my next rod. This rod was designed and developed by a good friend of mine, Larry Muse. Larry, he designed a roller rod. He uses this rod when he's suspend fishing. So you see a lot of these guys on Wilson and Wheeler, they're going out there, even the Ohio River in low current situations. They got their rods out, looks like they're spider rigging, and they're fishing vertical straight down. This rod allows that fish to come in. It's a really soft tip rod. So that fish is going to come in and start loading that rod. And as your line's rolling through these line rollers, it's really smooth. that fish doesn't know you're even on the other end. So you have that fish hooked before he even knows he picked up a piece of bait hooked to a rod. So when you get into fish that's been stuck a lot, you can change what you're doing. And again, it requires having the rod or the equipment designed specifically for that kind of situation. Any questions about that? Okay. One more presentation that I've got on this rod, what's really, that we've done for a long time. Years ago, people would go out there and they would just drift. They'd throw a windsock in, just let the boat drift. And you catch a lot of fish that way. I grew up fishing that way. We caught just tons of fish doing that. But as time goes on, you want to get more specific. You want to get to where you're better than the boat next door. Because if you're just sitting out there drifting with the wind, you got to be pretty lucky to just come across that fish. So you want to get out there and you want to try to target these fish, be it on the edge of a bank, creek bank where it drops off or whatever, some kind of a break. And to do that, you got to do a technique that we call dragging. And a lot of guys think that dragging's somewhat new. It's not. It's been around for a long time. And by dragging, I mean you drop your trolling motor and you drag that bait, but you can control that boat. You can stay on your contour lines or the top of that creek bank or whatever type of structure that you found these fish on and pull that bait right to the fish. But what I've found that helps us, you know, first of all, you can catch that fish just using a weight and a 12-inch, 18-inch, 24-inch leader with a hook. But we spent a lot of time, and I know there's all kinds of different things on the market, but this is what we specifically use when we're dragging. And again, we're going back. Can I get you to hold this, sir? Sure. So coming off of that rod is still the 80-pound spider wire stealth. The first thing that we come to right here, I got a sinker slide. I've got that sinker slide on there just so I can change weights. Because as I'm pulling or dragging that bait or drifting or whatever I'm doing, if you're on a rough bottom, you don't want that pole sitting there doing this number. You want to keep everything as smooth as you can. So where that starts is with this weight. So if you can get by with 1 ounce of weight, use 1 ounce. Don't use 8 ounces. The more weight you put on here, the more that rod's jerking, the more all of that's transferring back here to the bait. So the whole thing about this is to try to keep your presentation as natural as possible. But again, sinker slide so you can change the size of the weight. Right below that is another McMahon snap. So if I break off or want to change my presentation, I unsnap that, change my presentation. So coming off of that, I've got basically just a 3-foot leader. And I'm going to get to why we have a 3-foot leader. Coming off of that, at this end is another McMahon snap. And this is just a regular 18 to 24-inch leader. So our goal here is we're dragging the baits, the sinker's down like that. We got all this line back here, and we always use a float to help keep this bait, keep your hook up out of the debris, so the fish can find it easier. You're not getting hung up as much. But the reason for all this length, I have people ask me all the time, you know, I catch fish with my weight right here and an 18-inch leader. And you can. I've caught hundreds of fish doing that. But what we have figured out over the years to help us catch bigger fish, this long 3-foot section that's in the middle between the weight and here, it does one thing. It acts as a shock absorber. So as this bait's being pulled through the water, and this is going back to me saying we want this bait to look as natural in the water as possible. This 3-foot piece here in the middle, as that sinker's being drug across the bottom and you're hitting the rocks and stuff, if you got that weight right here, 12 inches or 18 inches from that hook, that bait is doing everything that weight's doing. If that weight's jerking through the water, the bait's jerking through the water. And most of the time in the world, you're not, you know, as that bait fish is dying or whatever, these fish are not seeing that bait fish jerking through the water. It's an unnatural movement. So this leader piece here in the middle that's about 36 inches long, it's a shock absorber. So as that weight is on the bottom and you're dragging it through the rocks or whatever, this piece here with this float back here, as that's jerking, this piece in the middle is actually kind of moving back and forth. It's a lot smoother. We sat there and visibly done test after test in a swimming pool in South Carolina. The motel didn't like us very well, but we was able to see the different lengths and how that bait would pull and move through the water. And I ain't gonna name any names, but he's a prominent catfisherman that catches a lot of fish and won a lot of tournaments. We sat there and done this probably 20 years ago. This system works. You hang up less, you catch bigger fish. Any questions? Yes, sir.
That size float, do you think it has the buoyancy to float a good piece of chunk bait or a whole fish?
The question is the size of the float. How big a float do you need to float the bait up? So that goes back to what size bait you're using. So if you're fishing a 3 or 4 inch shad, this is adequate. But we've been on Wilson and Wheeler before, and we're dragging 2-pound skipjack. Okay, this ain't big enough. So we're going to give away all the secrets now. So what we do then, instead of putting it on the line, I have stuffed 2 or 3 of these right down the throat of a skipjack. That will make that fish float up. Okay, so you want to adjust it that way. So we actually just stick it right in the bait, and that'll pull it up. Okay, and you can learn a lot by going to the swimming pool or a kiddie pool or anything, and you can see visibly what you're doing. So that's some of the stuff that we've done over the years. And you know, I've got a lot of experience at it, so we've done put a lot of time on the water without experimenting, but you'll save yourself a lot of time if you can visibly see what you're doing. Any more questions? Yes, sir.
What's the difference in the dragging and bumping? Are you
What's the,
dragging-
yeah, okay, I should explain that better. Question is, what's the difference between dragging and bumping? When you're actually bumping and your boat is slipping, say the current of the river, the Mississippi or whatever, it's going that way, the nose of the boat is facing upriver into the current, and the boat is slipping backwards with the current. So when we're bumping, we're fishing current on a river, okay? When we're dragging, we're typically on a big body of water, big lake. Lake of the Ozarks, Truman Reservoir, Wilson, Wheeler, any of those. That way we can pull that bait, we can drag that bait to where we want to drag it to. Follow the contour lines or whatever to the high percentage areas to get it to that fish. Okay? Yes, sir.
Specific dragging speed you like?
Dragging speed that I like when I'm dragging, and that's another area that's a big controversy. I like to stay about 0.8 miles per hour. So part of where it can get into controversy is if the fish are in a negative mood, if you speed that boat up to say 1.2 miles an hour, you will sometimes get that reaction strike. But if I had to pick one specific speed, I would keep about 0.8 miles per hour. Any more questions? I guess everybody learned everything today, so we're all professionals. There we go.
How did you catch those on Truman?
How did we catch them on Truman?
What method of that?
What we do, and part of the reason I like to go down there and fish there this time of year, I'm an old guy, so I'm slowing down. I want it to be as easy as I can get. This time of year is the easiest fishing that we do all year with the least amount of work. So we go back and we was anchor fishing in about 3 feet of water. So there's these big mud flats. There's, you know, I have people ask me all the time, how do you know what mud flat to go to? Because there, you know, there's acres and acres and acres of it. First thing I do is try to idle through at a slow speed with my side scan. I'll shrink my side scan down to about 80 to 100 feet, and you will be amazed at how many fish that you can find, and you'll find little pockets of them. So I try to liken this to like I'm assuming a lot of you have seen a flock of turkey feeding across the field. So you'll get maybe a flock of 20 turkey, and they're out there, they're together, but they're scattered out. but they're all kind of generally feeding and moving in one direction. But there may not be another group of them turkey for another quarter mile or half mile up here. It's no different on these mud flats. We'll drive through, we'll idle through with our side scan, and when you find that pot of fish, that's where we stop. So all we was doing was anchoring the boat, front and back, fan casting around the boat. We'd sit there about 30, 45 minutes, depending on how long they kept coming. When that bite quit, we just idle around until we found another group of fish. Very simple, very easy, as easy efficient as you can get.
Big like that?
Actually, all we was doing was really simple. We just had a weight. We was throwing about 3 ounces anchor fish with just a sinker, or a hook, no float, no nothing. Simple, simple, simple. Simple as we could get. Yes, sir.
Do you ever use the floats anchor fishing in the Missouri?
Yes. Question is, have I ever used floats on the Missouri River? Yes, I have. As I anchor fish, we'll do that sometimes, especially if we're in an area where we get off the main stem of the river and into slower current. So we experiment with a lot of different things. So again, going back to bulking your bait up to get that pull, if you're trying to walk bait, these floats will do the same thing. It will give you that more pull to pull that bait. So if you're in a slower area, but if you go back to and you watch these guys, if you spent much time on the Missouri River, the Mississippi, or any of these rivers, all your jug fishermen that's using the old jugs or the noodles or whatever, they're just putting it on a float and then throwing it out there and letting it go. Okay, so one of the big misconceptions is you have to catch catfish on the bottom. I'm here to tell you no. These fish utilize that whole system from top to bottom. So we catch fish a lot of times with floats on the Missouri River, on the Mississippi River, and if we're vertically fishing, a lot of times we'll put a big float on, throw it off to the side out of the way and just let that boat drift. A lot of times that cork or float or whatever you want to call it that's drifting over there on its own, it'll just go right under. It's no different than the guys using a noodle or a jug. Yes, sir.
So, if you're just starting out bumping, how many minutes or how often do you bump that bait down?
Okay. Question is, when you're new to bumping, how often do you bump it down the river or how far? So when you anchor that boat and you start moving that bait, as you get farther away from the boat, you're going to get less feel. So you're going to be limited on how far you can get away from the boat and still feel that bait. But I think maybe your question was more how often to move. So we'll go through with our electronics first and try to mark some fish, and we'll bump through there 2 or 3 times. And at that point, if we don't get bit, then we'll move the boat. Okay. I do want to say one thing about going back on to the movement of bait instead of just bumping bait. You know, I see a lot of boats that's doing that steady drift down the Mississippi or the Missouri, and everybody in that boat's, it looks like they're the same distance from the boat, 150 feet or whatever, and that's a comfortable range. But when you truly learn how to move bait correctly, the furthest I've ever caught a fish from the boat was 700 feet. So you can get to where, with feel and practice and time, that you can move that bait a long ways from the boat. So even if you're anchored, you're covering a lot of ground. Okay? Yes, sir.
What about the rattles?
What about rattles? I've used rattles in the past, and I think sometimes they do help. It will kind of alert that fish. So really, to me, anything that you can do, that you can try like that, it's going to help up your odds a little bit. Now, we don't use rattles all the time. We do use them sometime. I think when we got fish that we think is in a negative mood, we'll use rattles. We use scents sometimes. We haven't touched on any of that. But the biggest thing to learn that I suggest to take away from this is to try different things. I've gone through my whole life just trying different things. It's really easy to fall back and just get in that rut and do the same thing over and over. But if you keep trying new things, you're going to learn stuff. And I think that's where Jason and Daryl Massingale, they've excelled. They have learned. They're on this, they're learning every time they're on the water. And I think that's a huge, huge thing for people. Any more questions? Yes, sir.
You talked about using electronics to identify fish. We have a large Asian carp population in our area. Any tips for differentiating between the two?
Yep. So the question is, on electronics, can you differentiate between an Asian carp or whatever's there in that blue cat or flathead or whatever you're fishing for? So the answer is yes and no. So does that unit, I've a good friend of mine, Phil King, he'll sit here and tell me definitely, specifically, that he can tell this arch is a blue cat and this arch is a Asian carp. And I think to a certain extent you can, if you spend a lot of time on electronics and looking at them, just by the fuzziness and the way that return is. I will tell you right now, I do know what a spoonbill or a paddlefish looks like. It's totally different on the electronics, 100%. But what I try to tell people, that if you're not sitting there looking at that electronics all the time to where you really get that knowledge, you got to learn the habits of the fish. So you'll get that Asian carp, a lot of times he's going to prefer more dead water behind a dike or in a hole. That's when you get these big clouds of bait in there. For the most part, if you're going down the river channel on the Missouri or the Mississippi and you find that one big lone arch over there by itself, that's a blue cat. Okay? Same way, like even if you got Asian carp around that fish, that one big arch over there by himself, that's a blue cat. I mean, if you was a 4-inch long shad and there's a 100-pound blue over there, would you be over there laying by him? If you are, you're not going to be there very long. So a lot of times that big fish, he's going to be by himself. So we really kind of look at where that fish, how that fish is in that environment. That will tell you, to me, that will tell you more than just, one arch in the middle of 50 other arches. Okay? Yes, sir.
How do you tell the difference in a blue and a spoonbill? Or what the spoonbill looks like?
How do you tell the difference between a blue and a spoonbill? So on my unit, and I'm a firm believer, every unit's a little bit different. I'm on Hummingbird's pro staff, so I run Hummingbird, and I'm not promoting just them. I think Lowrance, Garmin, all of them are really good units in the world that we live in today. But what I've noticed, and we spend a lot of time on Truman and Lake of the Ozarks and places where there's a high population of spoonbill. That spoonbill, you'll get that big solid arch like you do on a blue cat, but right in the middle of it where their air bladder is, and that's really what your return is coming off their air bladder. It's like a perfectly round spot right in the middle of that arch, and it's really, it's almost gleaming, if you will. And it is spoonbill, spoonbill, spoonbill.
On your side imaging, can you see their bill?
I personally can't. I think if you really shrink it down to a small, where you're only covering 30 or 40 feet each side of the boat, you probably can. What I mainly look for is the shadow from that fish to see how big that shadow is. I know somebody way back there in the back. Yes, sir.
What was your largest and average size on Truman last week?
Largest and average size on Truman last week. Last week was really bad. We caught a lot of fish. We caught only one fish over the slot. We have a slot limit on Truman from 24 to 32 inches. You can't keep any fish. You can keep fish over and keep fish under. But most of our fish last week in pounds was from 5 pounds to 22 pounds, I think was our biggest. But what I do know, last year when we fished it, about 2 or 3 weeks later than this, when we started getting warmer water temperatures, we was always catching at least one fish in the 40 to 50 pound range. Even though we was catching a lot of 15s, 20s, and 30s, we was still catching bigger fish. Okay? Any more questions? Well, I guess I'm going to wrap it up, and if anybody wants to see any of the equipment after I'm done, just feel free. I'll be sitting back there in a bit, and you can come up and look at it. Thank you.